Welcome to Trauma-Informed 101. Completion of this presentation, along with the passing of the knowledge check on the training website, will meet state requirements for the annual training of trauma-informed care practices. Additional trainings will be accessible through the OCFS training website as they become available. The goal for this training is to create shared language around the definition of trauma, shared knowledge regarding some common concepts that come into play in the field of trauma-informed care, and to provide a set of shared values by way of reviewing the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration's 6 key principles of a trauma-informed approach. It's important to note that sometimes the topic of trauma itself can be difficult for some to talk about. Feel free to pause the video and take breaks as needed to take care of yourself. This presentation references a number of different entities and professionals and is not an endorsement of any particular model. The training can be done individually or in a group setting with a facilitator. You're encouraged to pause along the way for personal reflection or to expand on concepts and key learnings with your group. So why is it important to not only provide trauma-informed care practices to children and families, but to also adopt a trauma-informed approach within our organizations? Because trauma affects everyone. Trauma is known to be a widespread and costly public health issue which occurs as a result of violence, neglect, and emotionally harmful experiences, which could include things like bullying or harassment due to racial, ethnic, or gender differences. Trauma knows no boundaries, regardless of your age or socioeconomic status, regardless of if you live in a city or a rural setting. It is an almost universal human experience, particularly for those with mental health and substance use issues. To say trauma impacts everyone is a big statement, a powerful one, and one that is true. We'll be talking about how we define trauma, and this will demonstrate that even if you yourself have not been traumatized, it has affected those you know, those you serve in your work, and those with whom you work alongside. As such, the need to address trauma in our society and in our culture is paramount. It's an integral part of an effective behavioral health intervention and requires a multi-pronged, multi-agency public health approach. No one of us can do it alone. Because trauma is so prevalent and the response is so important, it is vital that as a system we have a shared language for how we define trauma. Believe it or not, there are many different ways in which trauma is defined. The DSM states that trauma is an actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. The APA defines it as an emotional response to a terrible event, like an accident, rape, or natural disaster. The National Institute for Mental Health tells us a traumatic event is a shocking, scary, or dangerous experience that can affect someone emotionally or physically. The definition we are going with for the purposes of this training is provided by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA. SAMHSA defines trauma as the result of an event, a series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and one that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. We'll be expanding on this definition as we go through the presentation, and I promise I won't read all of the slides. You might have noticed in SAMHSA's definition these 3 E's were bolded. They're an important part of the definition, so let's take a moment to expand on them a bit. For someone to experience trauma symptoms, there has to be exposure to an event or circumstance that occurs. It can be actual or perceived, and may be a single incident or something that occurs over time. The actual occurrence or threat all by itself isn't what causes trauma. The person's experience of the event is what determines whether or not it's a trauma for them. What's traumatic for one individual may not be for another. If you think about siblings being removed from their home due to abuse or neglect, for one child, the abuse they experience may be where their trauma symptoms stem from. For the other sibling, they may experience the removal as the traumatizing event. It really depends on how the person labels or is disrupted, either physically or emotionally, that contributes to whether or not it's experienced as traumatic. The third factor that's a critical component of trauma is the adverse effects that one is left with after the event has occurred. They can occur immediately after someone experiences an event, or can be delayed hours, days, sometimes even months or years afterwards. These effects can be short or long term and can show up in many different ways, which we will get into shortly. So what are traumatic events? This might be a good place to pause and brainstorm what you commonly think of when you think of examples of traumatic events. Often when people think of trauma, they immediately think of the big bad traumatic events. Here are a few examples of what are commonly considered to be traumatic: experiencing or witnessing violence, loss, bullying, chronic or serious illness, racism, terrorism. Yes, all of these things have the potential to cause trauma, and it's important to keep in mind, we're really going to drive this home, trauma is more than an event. In this presentation, we're going to go a bit further to expand our definition of trauma to be more in line with current research. As we mentioned before, not all traumatic events cause a trauma response, and it's important to also note, not all trauma hurts. Research done by Dr. van der Kolk broadens our understanding and emphasizes it's not just the big bad events. Traumatization occurs when an individual lacks the internal and external resources to cope with what is happening or has happened to them. A trauma response can occur when someone experiences a traumatic event, adversity, or when living under chronic stress. Why is it important to include adversity and chronic stress in our definition of trauma? Studies have shown that trauma actually has an impact on our brains. Trauma can reshape our neural pathways, which impacts how we process information and how we respond to that information. It impacts how we think, feel, and act. It can actually cause our brains to shrink. Those who study these effects have found that adversity and chronic stress can have the same impact on our brains. In the next slide, we'll watch a short video that will demonstrate this impact. Before the video begins, I'd like to point out that not all stress is toxic or traumatic. There are positive stressors in life. Birthdays, weddings, starting a new job, or buying a home. Even holidays and vacations can be stressful, but still things we look forward to. When we're talking about chronic stress, we're referring to a prolonged or constant feeling of pressure or being overwhelmed, which can have a negative impact.
We all go through some kind of stress in our daily lives. It can be related to work, family, health, money, relationships, kids, the list goes on. And we all know that stress is bad for our physical and emotional health. But are you aware of the damaging effects of long-term chronic stress? Let's explore how stress affects your brain. According to researchers, chronic stress changes your brain structure and functions, which can lead to a myriad of mental problems. It increases the levels of a stress hormone called cortisol, affecting brain functions and putting you at risk for various mood disorders and other mental issues such as depression and anxiety. Your brain is surrounded by a protective shield called the blood-brain barrier. This layer filters harmful substances and prevents them from entering our brain. Now, what does this have to do with stress? Researchers believe that stress makes this barrier more leaky, allowing substances that you do not want in your brain to pass through, such as pathogens, toxins, and other harmful chemicals. High levels of stress hormones can stop the production of new brain cells in the part of your brain that stores memories, which can negatively affect your memory. Research has shown that exposure to stress right before a memory retention test leads to decreased performance in both human and animal subjects. Stress can actually kill your brain cells by creating molecules called free radicals in the brain. These free radicals attack brain cells, rupturing and killing newly formed ones. This was shown in a study where researchers exposed young rats to a stressful situation. After a week, they found that rats under stress had a reduced number of brain cells when compared to those in the control group. While stress reduces the size of brain areas associated with emotions and self-control, making it more difficult to deal with stressful situations in the future, It also increases the activity levels in the brain region known as the amygdala, which is the brain's fear center. So, as you get stressed, you become more fearful, which can lead to anxiety and more stress, which causes you to be fearful, which causes, well, you get the point. Stress also increases the production of myelin, an insulating layer around the nerve cells, but produces fewer neurons. This excess of myelin disturbs the balance of communication and timing within the brain circuitry, disrupting how neurons connect with each other. The brain has special immune cells called microglia that protect the brain from infections and toxins. Once these immune cells are activated, they cannot switch off until they die, which can result in brain inflammation. Under the effects of chronic stress, these microglia can become activated. In other words, when your head is full of stress, your brain can literally become inflamed. When you are under stress, your body does not produce the feel-good hormones such as dopamine and serotonin in the ways that it should. Low levels of these hormones over longer periods of time can leave you depressed and more prone to addiction. One of the most worrying effects of stress on the brain is that it increases your risk for neurodegenerative diseases such as dementia and Alzheimer's. I know this was a lot of information, and now you might be stressed out about being stressed out. Take a deep breath and relax. The effects of stress on the brain don't need to be permanent, and by being aware of your own mental health, you can learn techniques to identify your stressors and mitigate their impact on you. It's important to keep these things in mind and to recognize your limits. By doing this, you can take much better care of yourself and be able to manage your life more confidently.
Feel free to pause the presentation here and reflect on what we've gone over so far. Is any of this new information to you? What are some of your reactions to the information in the video? How do you recognize signs or symptoms of chronic stress within yourself? Considering what we've learned so far, the widespread impact of trauma, adverse experiences, and chronic stress, knowing that it's so pervasive, it's imperative that we're able to raise our awareness and recognize the possible symptoms of trauma in those around us. So what does it look like? What do we see? In the same ways that individuals experience trauma differently, we respond to those experiences differently. In some, their experience may be expressed outwardly in big ways. You might see some aggressive behaviors or problems with conduct. Others might respond in less obvious ways and put on a brave face for the world. You might see nervousness or confusion, excitability or sadness. There's no one-size-fits-all. In fact, the possible list of symptoms goes on, and this is not an exhaustive list of possibilities. I like this quote from Dr. Porges. Trauma compromises our ability to engage with others by replacing patterns of connection with patterns of protection. Sometimes the behaviors we see in others are really survival skills that people have learned to cope with difficult situations. It's also important to note that the presence of these behaviors does not necessarily denote that a trauma has occurred, but it does highlight the need to ask and understand what is happening for people when their behaviors seem out of character or out of sorts, or just don't seem to match the situation at hand. Let's take a look at some real-life examples of what a trauma response might look like. Though these are actual examples, names and ages have been changed. We have Katie, a freshman in high school. Katie often appears disinterested in what's happening around her. She mumbles, fidgets, and rarely makes eye contact. She's very bright, but she's failing in her classes. She's fallen asleep in class, and the more people try to connect with her, the more she pulls away. Melody is a second grader and a bit of a class clown. Her teachers have noted that she's quick to escalate, having frequent tantrums that don't seem age appropriate or even appropriate to the situation. She can be laughing one minute and crying the next. And finally, James is in 8th grade, and people are starting to notice a behavior change. He's gone from being a pretty easygoing kid to more and more irritable and aggressive. He started challenging authority figures and refusing to do his classwork. It can be really difficult for him to calm back down once he's triggered. What are some other situations or responses that you might have seen in your work? Feel free to pause the video again here and discuss or reflect. The examples we just reviewed were all of trauma responses in youth. If we're going to truly apply the concepts we've been talking about, that trauma impacts us all, we've got to acknowledge that that means us too. Trauma doesn't stop at age 18, so let's take a look at some examples of what a trauma response might look like in a work environment. Melinda is a long-term employee who used to always eat lunch in the break room. Recently, she's begun keeping to herself more and more, eating lunch at her desk. She's been showing up to work late, sometimes even leaving early, and calling out sick more than usual. She seems to be rushed much of the time and hasn't really been interacting with her coworkers at all. Bob is a bit of a hothead, often storming into his office, shutting the door, and telling his office mate Anne that he just needs to vent. He complains about the organization's leadership, stating things are never done fairly around here. Anne is finding it more and more difficult to get her work done as Bob's venting is taking up more and more of her time. So let's talk about Anne. Anne is generally on time with her work, but she's also feeling more pressure due to her time spent listening to Bob. Anne gets an email from her supervisor asking if she'll be getting her notes in on time. The email is written in red with the deadline highlighted in yellow and underlined. Anne is not happy and sends a lengthy email back outlining all of the reasons why this is not possible, mostly throwing Bob under the bus. She lets her supervisor know she demands a change in office location. So what are your thoughts? What's happening for these folks? This might be a good time to once again pause the video and consider what trauma responses you've noted in these examples. We're going to take a look now at another short 5 or 6 minute video that demonstrates how trauma can impact brain functioning. The information is presented by Dr. Bruce Perry, a psychiatrist, researcher, and educator. The discussion in the video is focused on children in a school setting, but the concepts can be applied more broadly.
The term frequently used by an educator or an adult when they're trying to explain sort of difficult behaviors is that the child knows better, the child's choosing to do this, and it's intentionally directed at me. And all three of those are inaccurate. You can certainly see why somebody would say that, but it really that comes from a misunderstanding of the sequential nature of human processing and human behavior. Most of these misbehaviors that kids have in a classroom are not because they planned it out on the top part of their head and then told the lower parts of their brain, oh, go be a jerk, go disrupt class. It's because something came in from the bottom and stirred them up and shut down the thinking part of their brain. So when you sit down with them and they're calm and feel safe, the thinking part of their brain goes, oh yeah, I know better. I know you shouldn't do that. I know the rules of the class. And then an hour later, if you know the rules of the class and you are breaking them, the teacher has no other choice but to think that that's intentional because he knows better. But in fact, what's happened is it's basically temporary cortical shutdown. And everybody has this in their lives, right? I mean, think about it. I don't think anybody out there who's listening hasn't had a moment where they were unable to retrieve something that they knew. And a classic example is if you're like with a bunch of people and somebody's talking about, well, what was the Academy Award-winning film? And, a couple of years ago, and you go, oh, I know what it was. It was the one with that guy that did this and did that, and you can't remember it. And then on your drive home, you go, oh, it's blah, blah, blah. It's not as if the information, it was in your head. You just couldn't retrieve it under pressure. And that's an example of state-dependent functioning, which is another one of the core concepts that we teach in the neurosequential model. All functioning of the human brain is what we call state-dependent. And what that means is when you're in a state of calm, you've got certain systems open that you can use. But as soon as you start to get distressed, overwhelmed, frustrated, you start to lose access to those systems. It's state-dependent. So cognition is very state dependent. You can take people with IQs of 130 and you put them in a pressure situation and their problem-solving capabilities will decay to exhibit a problem-solving capability of an IQ of about 105. And that's a 25-point drop, literally can happen in 3 minutes. And it's not because they really have an IQ of 105. It's just because you put them under pressure and their ability to function in that moment was compromised. And this happens day in and day out with kids who've been exposed to trauma or exposed to patterns of stress activation where there's unpredictability or chaos. It doesn't have to be these extreme capital T traumas. It can be kids living in poverty, kids that have housing or food insecurity, kids that are marginalized or feel like they don't belong because they're immigrants or they're not the right color or not the right religion. And that will literally activate your stress response system in ways that make it activate and shut down the cortex. And so these kids will have a harder time in school. It all starts from a sense of safety. And because of the way human beings are organized, human beings are very relational creatures. We're social animals, right? And so if you feel as if you belong, you feel safe. I could go into the really complex neurobiology, but the bottom line is that there's systems in our brain that are involved in helping us judge whether or not we belong or whether or not we don't belong. And if we get the sense from our peers and from our teacher that we belong, we feel safe. And when you feel safe, your cortex is open for business. And this is why things like bullying are so toxic. When you're starting to be extruded by other kids in your class for whatever reason, and the teachers may not catch that, this child is going to be dysregulated and not feel like they belong. They won't feel safe in the classroom and they won't learn. And it's one of the things that we try to help educators learn more about when we use this neurosequential model.
Some questions you might want to consider after watching. How did this resonate with you? Have you experienced the stress response Dr. Perry is describing, or have you witnessed it in others? If stress can impact our thinking and our behavior so profoundly in the moment, imagine the impact chronic stress can have over time on our thought patterns. We've spent some time now talking about what we see. We understand that trauma is a pervasive problem which impacts all of us. So, how do we respond? What can we do? Practicing trauma-informed care means doing something differently. We have to change our approach in order to create a safe environment that promotes healing. We start by changing our lens, and to do this, we have to ask a different question. I'm sure many of us, if not all of us, have seen someone behave in a way that we didn't understand and either think to ourselves, or maybe even ask out loud, "What is wrong with you?" Think for a moment. How would it feel to instead ask, "What's happened to you?" Or "What's happening for you?" Does this change how you view the person or their behavior? Asking what happened to you, instead of what's wrong with you, allows us to come from a place of kindness and compassion rather than blame and shame. If we are to work together to promote a caring, safe, and healing environment, changing the question is a shift that we have to make. We'll now begin to take a look at some concepts that exist in trauma theory, which can further our understanding of trauma and identify some methods for intervening. These slides will provide an introduction to these concepts, and additional trainings will be made available in the future. You may want to do some additional research into these topics, and there are many resources out there should you wish to do so. Several resources will also be provided at the end of this presentation. The first concept we'll be talking about is the Adverse Childhood Experiences, or ACE study. The study was completed in the mid-90s through a collaboration between the Center for Disease Control, CDC, and Kaiser Permanente. Doctors Vincent Folletti and Robert Anda led the research, surveying over 17,000 individuals about adverse experiences in their first 18 years of life. What the research found was a direct relationship exists between adverse childhood experiences and poor health outcomes later in life. It also showed us the widespread prevalence of adverse experiences. Only 1/3 of those surveyed reported an ACE score of 0. Of those who did report having an ACE, 87% had a score of 2 or higher. They also found that the higher the ACE score someone had, the higher their risk. There's a lot of information available about the ACEs study, and we'll be looking at some statistics in a moment. But I first want to underline the importance of what this study shows us. It's foundational to the underpinnings of trauma, that it's pervasive and affects everyone. The study itself actually received criticism for its simplicity, noting the majority of those surveyed were white, middle-class Americans, almost half of whom had college degrees. They were all employed with access to good health care. It didn't include any variation in education, those living in poverty, or significant representation from varying races, ethnicities, or cultures. It also didn't assess adverse experiences which occur outside the home. Because of these considerations, more recent research suggests the prevalence of ACEs is actually much higher than the original study suggested. The ACEs questionnaire itself consists of 10 questions which focused on 3 types of adverse experiences: abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. Scores are not impacted by the frequency with which an event happened or occurred, and each item is only scored if it occurred in the first 18 years of life. If you'd like to review the questions, a link is provided here which will take you to aces2high.com. You are not required to complete the ACEs questionnaire as part of this training, and no one will ask you to share your ACE score. Dr. Block, who's the former president of the AAP, once stated that ACEs are the single greatest unaddressed public health threat facing our nation. That's an incredibly powerful statement, and one that's in line with SAMHSA's guidelines regarding trauma-informed care. Looking at this data, it once again supports the fact that adverse childhood experiences don't discriminate. They cross gender as well as race, socioeconomic status. It's all of us, and it's a public health concern that is both costly and deadly. ACE scores increase our likelihood of a variety of health risks, some of which are outlined here on this slide. Additional data shows those with an ACE score are 2 to 4 times more likely to start using alcohol or drugs at an early age, and those with an ACE of 5 or higher are up to 10 times more likely to experience addiction. This graphic depicts a common visual you'll see when researching information about ACEs. It demonstrates the progression some experience. Adverse childhood experiences can lead to social, emotional, and cognitive impairments, which can lead to the adoption of health risk behaviors. We then start to see disease, disability, and social problems, and ultimately find that people are actually dying up to 20 years earlier than those who do not experience adverse childhood experiences. Given the prevalence, given the data, I think you can see why this is referred to as a significant public health issue, But let's not lose hope. It's not all doom and gloom. So with that in mind, I'd like you to note the gaps in between each level of the pyramid. We'll be coming back to these gaps in just a little bit. But before we do, I'd like us to once again revisit the idea that trauma-informed care is about all of us. Please pause here and reflect on the following questions. Since trauma impacts us all, what does that mean for how we respond to one another? To those who might see you in a position of power or authority, or for those who may be your leaders? Is it possible to be kind, caring, and compassionate while still maintaining healthy boundaries? How will you do that? In the next few slides, we'll be taking a look at some concepts that you might find helpful in answering these questions. I'd encourage you to start by remembering, in a trauma-informed culture, we change that question. We ask what's happening, and we first seek to understand. Parallel process is an interesting concept that plays out in a lot of different ways. It was initially defined as a dynamic that had the potential to exist in therapeutic relationships, when a counselor would act out what was happening for their client in supervision. It's since been expanded and applied to systems and how they can develop similar thoughts, feelings, or behaviors. When an individual or organization experiences stress, you can see the impacts of that stress reach beyond that one individual or that one entity. As one example, if an organization is experiencing workforce shortages, you might see increased stress on staff, which can have an impact on services for clients. Likewise, when clients are stressed, there may be an impact in the opposite direction. The intent here isn't to assign blame or responsibility for stressors, but to help highlight the impact stress can have on individuals and organizations. The key is to learn to recognize it when it's happening so we can intervene. By doing so, we can interrupt parallel processes and prevent them from being a barrier to quality trauma-informed care. To help us recognize when negative parallel processes might be in play, these are some symptoms you might see: a sense of hopelessness, less productivity or progress, burnout, or just an overall sense that the culture is starting to feel toxic. The good news is it works both ways. Just like we can experience negative parallel processes, which can weigh us down, positive parallel processes exist too. This slide highlights some strategies individuals and organizations can put into play to help mitigate stressors and create more positive parallel processes. Practicing good self-care, communicating openly, seeking or providing regular supervision, and asking for help. These are all excellent ways to create and maintain a trauma-informed culture. Reenactment describes a process where a person may repeat thoughts and behaviors that stem from a traumatic experience with the goal of resolving and healing from that experience. Reenactment is a complex concept which can have a potentially serious impact on a person's functioning and their relationships. It's been prevalent in psychology for many, many years and is a very useful concept to consider when thinking about how we respond to trauma and how we can intervene in a trauma-informed way. But how? In the 1960s, Dr. Cartman developed the drama triangle to describe the roles individuals take on when acting out reenactments. This representation of the way in which we as humans continually replay our conflicts is one that many find helpful in identifying that a trauma response is happening. If we can do that, if we can recognize what's happening, we're more likely then to step out of these roles and try something different. Cartman's drama triangle takes a very complex concept and conceptualizes it in a way that makes reenactments more easily understood and recognized. There are 3 roles: the persecutor, the victim, and the rescuer. We see these roles played out in countless ways, time and time again, in movies, in your favorite TV shows, right down to family feuds and workplace conflicts. Once you understand these roles, you can often step back and identify who's stepped in to play which roles, even yourself, sometimes especially yourself. We sometimes move through all three roles, and conflicts unfold as we move around the triangle. So let's take a look at these three roles. The persecutor. Often perceived as controlling and blaming of others, the persecutor is superior, critical, rigid, and authoritarian. When someone's in this role, you might see bullying and threatening behaviors. The victim, often seeing themselves as blameless, they feel helpless and powerless, incapable of effecting any change. The victim often feels little hope for the future or that things can change. And the rescuer, always there to fix the problem and save the day. Often viewed by others as a bit of a meddler, this role enables the victim. The rescuer needs the victim to remain in their role in order to feel valued. The rescuer generally ends up feeling martyred and can become frustrated with the victim, sometimes even shifting into the role of the persecutor over time. There is good news, however. We can change the conversation and change this dynamic. It takes self-awareness, patience, and practice. It's important to keep in mind that these behaviors are unintentional. We subconsciously take on these roles, and the behaviors you see or that you take on may be coping strategies that have worked in a self-protective manner in the past. Let's think back for just a minute to some of the scenarios we saw earlier, particularly regarding Bob and Anne. Were they in a reenactment? What roles did they take on? How were they each a persecutor, a victim, or a rescuer? I'm going to put their stories up again and ask that you pause the video and reflect on these questions. Some quick tips for staying out of that pesky triangle. To achieve a different outcome, you have to do things a little differently. The first step is to recognize that you are, in fact, in a triangle. Take a moment to reflect on where you are. What role are you playing? At what point did you enter this role? And finally, rescript. Change the conversation. Use I statements to take responsibility of your own thoughts, feelings, and actions instead of attributing them to another. How might Bob and Anne have used I statements to rescript their experience? It's really not easy. It takes a lot of practice. You might find that you get really, really good at recognizing a reenactment after the fact, which is okay. Seek supervision, have those conversations, and keep practicing. The idea that we can heal and recover from our trauma, adverse experiences, and chronic stress is a critical component to trauma-informed care practices. We need hope to keep us moving forward. It is possible to recover. It is possible to heal. And the science supports it. Remember those gaps I asked you to put a pin in? Let's go back to those for just a moment. Because in these gaps, that's where the hope lies. The gaps are where we can intervene. We can actually prevent those we serve and ourselves from progressing up that pyramid. We talked earlier about the impact of trauma, adverse experiences, and chronic stress on the brain. The good news here is the brain can heal as well. We can rebuild those neural pathways and create positive, protective thought patterns. Building resiliency is key, and we can put protective factors in place. So first, what is resiliency? The APA defines it as the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant sources of stress. We can learn skills that can help us adapt and overcome our challenges. Dr. Kenneth Ginsberg and Martha Jablow define the 7 C's of resiliency. Helping develop these 7 C's can increase an individual's resiliency over time. Supporting people in developing competence and confidence in their abilities to handle difficult situations. Fostering healthy relationships with caring individuals. Providing opportunities to have a positive impact, and being able to have a sense of control over your life and your decisions. These are all ways that we can support the development of resiliency. Another framework for helping build and maintain resilience is known as the 5 protective factors. This framework was developed through the Center for the Study of Social Policy and outlines parental resilience, social connectedness, knowledge of parenting and child development, having concrete support in times of need, and the social and emotional competence of children as 5 critical areas where we can establish and support resiliency in young people. Now that we've talked about a shared definition for trauma-informed care and had an overview of some concepts that provide us with a shared knowledge base, let's take a look at additional guidance from SAMHSA, which will provide us with a shared set of values for implementing trauma-informed care within our organizations. According to SAMHSA, all individuals within trauma-informed organizations share 4 assumptions. They realize the impact of trauma is widespread and that recovery is possible. They recognize the signs and symptoms. They respond by applying knowledge at all levels. And they actively resist re-traumatization by putting knowledge into action. There are 6 key principles defined by SAMHSA, which are fundamental to a trauma-informed approach. They are safety, trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice, and last but not least, cultural, historical, and gender issues. We'll take a more in-depth look at each, beginning with safety. The very first key principle, safety, is paramount. Because trauma inherently involves a physical or emotional threat to one's sense of self, individuals are often hyper-alert to potential danger. It's essential that organizations prioritize safety for all, as defined by those the organization serves, and works to avoid re-traumatization. Having a shared definition of what safety is within your organization is essential and needs to include more than just physical safety. It's important people feel safe emotionally and interpersonally, as well as ethically and morally. I'm going to show you some examples of safety in an organization, but before I do, this would be a great place to pause the video and explore what safety could mean for you and your organization. Consider what safety might look like, feel like, and sound like. What would you see? What would you hear? In safe organizations, we find that people are honest. There are no harmful secrets or bullying. When people are speaking, you hear calmness in their voice. People are treated with courtesy, dignity, and respect. You hear people asking for help, and mistakes are viewed as opportunities for growth. The actual physical layout of the building is safe. It's well lit. Exits and restrooms are clearly marked. Staff and clients have and are encouraged to use safety plans or a list of coping strategies when feeling triggered. Principle 2 is trustworthiness and transparency. Building and maintaining trust for clients, families, and staff is of paramount importance within an organization. When boundaries are violated, particularly by someone in a position of power, an individual's ability to trust is impacted. A trauma-informed organization recognizes this and seeks to earn trust in the following ways: by providing clear, consistent policies with reasonable expectations, defining boundaries which everyone is both accountable to and accountable for, communicating in an open, bidirectional manner, and by providing quality training and coaching. SAMHSA's third key principle, peer support, promotes the ability to obtain support from our peers, those individuals who have lived experiences of trauma, chronic stress, and adversity. This is an easy one because remember, it's all of us. The commitment to this principle fosters a sense of safety and trust. It enhances collaboration among team members and promotes recovery. This can be achieved in the following ways: simply by checking in with one another. This is one of the easiest ways to let someone know they matter. By demonstrating a responsibility to one another, though it may not always feel comfortable, especially as you begin your practice, holding one another accountable to these principles in a caring way is an important aspect of maintaining a trauma-informed environment. This can sometimes be done by being aware of and bringing attention to potential reenactments, which could look like traumatic or excessive emotional responses. Ask that question, what's happening? We can support one another just by showing vulnerability and sharing our experiences. This can provide others with a sense of hope and togetherness. Another way we can support one another is by encouraging use of a safety plan or a list of coping strategies, and by encouraging regular self-care practices. Collaboration and mutuality is the fourth key principle. In a trauma-informed organization and practice, there's emphasis on the recognition of power differentials and dynamics, as well as a focus on relationship building. Everyone involved in the organization, including clients and families, participate in providing input and making decisions, while understanding at the same time, not everyone is the decision maker. This can happen in a variety of ways, which could include regular town hall meetings, having an open door policy, and acknowledgement by all members of the organization that they have a role in creating and maintaining a trauma-informed culture. Are there other opportunities that could be specific to your organization? Feel free to pause the video here and consider what this could look like in your organization. Key principle number 5 promotes empowerment, voice, and choice. Understanding that trauma, chronic stress, and adversity impacts us all, there's an organization-wide commitment to build on our individual strengths and experiences. Trauma-informed organizations work to promote individual voices and self-advocacy. There's recognition of the parallel processes that occur between organization staff and clients, and there's also an inherent belief that healing and recovery are possible. The sixth and final key principle is attending to cultural, historical, and gender issues. A trauma-informed organization acknowledges and actively strives to move beyond stereotypes and biases with regards to race, ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, age, and religion, and offers access to services to support the unique needs of all individuals. Within the organization, there are policies and procedures in place that are responsive to the needs of these individuals. Additionally, things that your organization may do to achieve this principle might include ongoing conversations about culture and historical trauma. Now that we've reviewed SAMHSA's 6 key principles of what practicing trauma-informed care is, let's talk about what it isn't. There are several common misconceptions or myths about what it means to be trauma-informed. It's not a quick fix. Practicing trauma-informed care does not absolve us of conflict. It doesn't make us perfect or take away all of our problems. What it does do is give us tools we can use and practice in order to address conflict. It helps us handle the hard things and the uncomfortable situations in a way that shows care and compassion for one another. Trauma-informed care is not just about the clients, and it is more than just being nice. It's about creating a safe environment for everyone and considering what that might look like, from the way we welcome people to how we communicate with one another, even right down to the physical layout of a building. One of the most common myths is that trauma-informed care means anything goes, and this is far from the truth. In trauma-informed organizations, there's actually a high degree of accountability. Practicing trauma-informed care creates a culture where there are shared values, shared language, and a shared expectation that all will engage in this practice with one another. If an expectation isn't being met, we talk about it. We don't ignore it until it becomes a bigger problem or act in ways that shame or blame the person. We approach it from the framework of trying to find out what's happening. We seek to understand. Consequences for our actions still exist, but they're aimed at rebuilding trust and maintaining the individual dignity of the person. Some people believe that this work is easy and anyone can do it. The truth is, this practice isn't for everyone. There are people who, at their core, believe that you just need to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and get on with it. Thinking, I got through it, why can't they? There are people who don't agree with the science behind trauma, and people who believe trauma-informed care is only for those who've experienced those big bad hardships in life. Individuals with these beliefs tend to struggle the most with trauma-informed care practices. True trauma-informed care practices involve all levels of an organization, from clients to administrative staff, direct care employees, supervisors, and leaders alike. The last myth I want to talk about here is the idea that if you're uncomfortable, you're not safe. Safety and comfort are not the same thing, and this is a very important distinction. Trauma-informed environments place emphasis on creating predictable environments with regards to how we manage ourselves and our interactions. We can be uncomfortable and still be safe. Creating a trauma-informed environment means creating something new. It means change. Change is often uncomfortable. It involves loss. If we can create spaces that are safe, yet uncomfortable, stepping out of our comfort zone, that's where we grow. You may hear people talk about what it means to be trauma-informed versus trauma-responsive. Being trauma-informed implies people have information and knowledge. It's often understood to define how we provide services to clients and their families. Trauma-responsive implies that we use this knowledge to respond positively to people displaying trauma symptoms and traumatic stress, while also managing our own chronic stress and trauma symptoms. It's a practice that broadens our definition. It creates a shared language, shared knowledge, and shared values, and promotes a proactive approach through incorporation of resiliency and recovery concepts. Informed tends to be more about the what, while responsive gets at the how. Some describe trauma responsiveness as the next frontier and conceptualizes what it means to not only be aware of and knowledgeable about trauma, but to also have the capability of responding. In Maine, we have a long history of implementing trauma-informed care practices, and we've done some really great work. It's time to start thinking about where we want to go next and how we get there. Some describe trauma-responsive care as the next frontier. Getting there is a process, and one that will take a shared commitment and ongoing practice. Working together, we can move in the direction of developing a trauma-responsive system of care in Maine. Before we close this training, let's pause one last time and think about next steps. What are your next steps? What are your areas for growth? What is one commitment you will make going forward to begin implementing your own trauma-informed or trauma-responsive care practices? Here are some resources you may find helpful in your own trauma-informed journey. These links will take you to a wide array of additional training materials and information that will be helpful in expanding your knowledge and practice of trauma-informed care. These links can also be found on the OCFS training website. This concludes Maine's Office of Child and Family Services Trauma-Informed 101 training. Thank you for the time you've taken to further your understanding of what it means to be trauma-informed. The last step in completing your training will be to complete a brief knowledge check by clicking the link to the quiz, which is found on the same OCFS training page where you access this webinar. If at any time you would like assistance in accessing additional training, please reach out to your OCFS resource coordinator. Thank you.